12 years. That's how long it took for my father to sit across from me again. Not at a family dinner, not at a hospital bedside, but in my boardroom, begging for a job he didn't know I controlled. He walked in with his chest puffed out, resume in hand, ready to impress. He didn't recognize the back of my chair. He couldn't see my face. So when the interviewer asked about his family, he laughed and said, "I have a useless daughter I kicked out years ago. Complete failure. Best decision I ever made." The room went silent. I let him finish. Then I turned my chair around. "My name is Kennedy Hayes. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of how the man who threw me away came crawling back, and what I did when he finally saw my face." If you're watching this, please subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. To understand what happened in that boardroom, you need to understand where I came from. I grew up in Cicero, a working-class suburb just outside Chicago. My father, Raymond Hayes, was a mid-level operations manager at Morrison Auto Parts. My mother, Linda, stayed home. And my brother Marcus, 4 years older than me, was the sun around which our entire family orbited. I remember the exact moment I learned my place in my father's world. I was 16, sitting at our scratched-up kitchen table, report card in hand. Straight A's. A 3.9 GPA. I'd just been named to the honor roll for the 6th consecutive semester. My father didn't even look at it. Instead, he cleared his throat and made an announcement. He was setting aside $45,000, every penny of the family's college fund, for Marcus. "A son needs an education to build a career," he said, cutting into his meatloaf. "A daughter just needs to marry well." I stared at him. "What about me?" He finally looked up. "You'll find a husband, Kennedy. A good one, if you're smart. He'll take care of you." Across the table, my mother said nothing. She just reached over and spooned more mashed potatoes onto Marcus's plate. Marcus, who had a 2.4 GPA. Marcus, who had already been suspended twice for skipping class. Marcus, who would later blow through that entire $45,000 on a business that collapsed in 4 years. But that night, none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence. My mother's silence, my brother's smirk, and the absolute certainty in my father's voice when he told me my future had already been decided. I was 16, and I had just learned exactly what I was worth to him. Nothing. I didn't accept that verdict. I applied for scholarships in secret, spent my lunch periods in the guidance counselor's office, and wrote essays until my fingers cramped. When the acceptance letter from the University of Illinois arrived, full ride, tuition, and housing covered, I thought my father might finally see me differently. He didn't. The real breaking point came 6 years later, in June of 2012. I was 22, freshly graduated with a degree in business administration. I'd done it without a single dollar from Raymond Hayes. That's when he called me into the living room and told me I was going to marry Thomas Brennan. Thomas was 31, the son of my father's business partner. I'd met him twice. He had soft hands, a receding hairline, and a way of looking at me that made my skin crawl. "This marriage will secure the partnership," my father said. "It's good for the family." "I'm not marrying someone I don't love," I said. "I have a degree. I'm going to build my own career." The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Then my father stood up. "Get out. Dad, get out of my house. Tonight." I packed one suitcase. My mother stood at the upstairs window, watching. She didn't come down. She didn't say goodbye. I walked out with $200 in my pocket and nowhere to go. That night, I slept in my car in a Walmart parking lot. The next morning, I checked my email at a public library. There was one new message from my father. Subject line, "Final." The body was 3 sentences. "Don't ever contact this family again. You are no longer my daughter. R. Hayes." I read it 7 times. Then I forwarded it to a new folder labeled Proof. 12 years later, that email would still exist, and someone else would have a copy. The years that followed were the hardest of my life, and the most important. I started as an unpaid intern at a small consulting firm downtown, answering phones and fetching coffee for people who didn't bother learning my name. Within 6 months, I'd talked my way into a paid position, $28,000 a year. I rented a studio apartment, 400 square feet, a hot plate instead of a stove, a mattress on the floor. I told myself it was temporary. I made it temporary. By 2015, I'd caught the attention of Margaret Sullivan, a senior partner at the firm. She was 51 then, sharp as a scalpel, with silver hair and zero tolerance for excuses. She saw something in me that I was still learning to see in myself. "You work harder than anyone here," she told me once, after I'd stayed until midnight restructuring a client presentation. "But you apologize too much. Stop that." She became my mentor. She also became the first person I ever told about my father. I showed her the email, the one I'd saved. She read it without expression, then looked at me and said, "Keep this. You never know when you'll need proof of who someone really is." I took her advice. By 2017, I was a manager making $85,000 a year. By 2019, I'd saved enough to take out an SBA loan and start my own firm, Meridian Consulting Group. By 2022, Forbes Chicago named me one of their top 30 under 40. The article included a full-page photo and my complete name, Kennedy Charlotte Hayes, founder and CEO. By 2024, Meridian had 89 employees, offices on the 42nd floor of Willis Tower, and annual revenue of $47 million. I had built everything my father said I couldn't. And then his resume landed on my desk. It was a Friday morning, April 12, 2024, when I saw his name. Derek Coleman, my head of HR, had sent me the shortlist for our open COO position. 3 finalists, all with impressive credentials. I was scrolling through on my tablet, coffee in hand, when I stopped cold. Candidate number 3, Raymond Douglas Hayes. Age 61. 28 years of operations management experience. Address, 847 Maple Street, Cicero, Illinois. My childhood home. I set down my coffee, read the name again, checked the address a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. My father, the man who had thrown me out with $200 and told me I was no longer his daughter, had applied for a job at my company. A position that would report directly to me. A role paying $285,000 a year plus equity. He had no idea. The public face of Meridian Consulting was K.C. Hayes. I'd used my initials deliberately, kept my photo minimal in press coverage, avoided industry events where old connections might surface. It was partly privacy, partly protection, and partly, if I'm honest, a way of making sure that if I ever succeeded, it would be entirely on my own terms, not because of my family name, and not in spite of it. Raymond Hayes had never bothered to look closely enough to recognize his own daughter. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I typed my reply to Derek. "Proceed as scheduled, Monday, 10 a.m. I called Margaret that night. She'd been Meridian's CFO since the beginning, the first person I'd hired when I started the company, the first person I'd trusted with the full truth of where I came from. Now 61 herself, she'd become more than a mentor. She was the closest thing I had to family. "His resume came through," I said, staring out at the Chicago skyline from my living room window. "He's a finalist for COO. A pause, then, "Raymond?" "Raymond Douglas Hayes, 28 years of experience, currently unemployed." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He has no idea who runs this company." "Kennedy." Her voice was careful. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." I pressed my palm against the cold glass. Part of me wants to reject him outright. Part of me wants to see what he does when he walks into that room. And what would that accomplish? I thought about it. The truth, maybe. I want to see who he really is when he thinks no one important is watching. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I still have that email," she said finally. The one you forwarded me in 2015. You are no longer my daughter. I've kept it in a secure folder all these years. I know. Whatever you decide, she said, make sure it serves you. Not him. Not revenge. You. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I will. After I hung up, I stood at the window for a long time, watching the city lights flicker below. Monday was coming, and with it, a reckoning 12 years in the making. I spent Saturday running scenarios. It's what I do. Break problems into components, map out contingencies, identify risks before they become crises. I'd built a $47 million company on that skill. Now I turned it on my own father. Scenario 1. I reject him before the interview. Clean, simple, done. But if he ever discovered who Casey Hayes was, he could claim discrimination. Age, family relationship, personal vendetta. The optics would be terrible. Worse, it would give him power over a narrative he didn't deserve to control. Scenario 2. I recuse myself entirely, let Derek and the board handle it. Professional, defensible, but I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what he would have said if given the chance. And there was something else, something harder to admit. I needed to see his face when he realized who I'd become. Scenario 3. I let the interview proceed normally. I observe. I listen. I let him reveal himself without knowing he's being watched by the one person he dismissed as worthless. That was the option I kept coming back to. There were risks. Our interview protocol, Article 14.3 of Meridian's HR guidelines, required all executive interviews to be recorded with candidate consent. Everything Raymond said would be documented. If I let emotion override judgment, if I said something unprofessional, it would be on record. But the same was true for him. I pulled up the pending contract with Hartwell Industries. $8.2 million, final negotiations scheduled for late April. One scandal, one whisper of impropriety, and the whole deal could collapse. I couldn't afford to be reckless, but I also couldn't afford to look away. Sunday night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my penthouse, 2,300 square feet of floor-to-ceiling windows, a far cry from that 400-square-foot studio, and pulled out the one photograph I'd kept from my old life. It was taken when I was 10. A family portrait at Sears, all four of us in matching blue sweaters. My father's hand rested on Marcus's shoulder. My mother stood slightly behind me, her smile thin and practiced. And I sat in front, gap-toothed and hopeful, still young enough to believe that if I just tried harder, worked smarter, I could earn my father's approval. I remembered the day after that photo was taken. I'd come home with a first-place ribbon from the school spelling bee. My father had actually smiled. "Good job, Kennedy," he'd said. "You're a smart kid." It was the last time he ever praised me without qualification. Within a year, Marcus started struggling in school and my father's attention pivoted entirely. Every conversation became about how to help Marcus. Every resource went to Marcus. Every plan for the future centered on Marcus. I set the photograph face down on the coffee table. I didn't need Raymond Hayes to validate me anymore. I'd spent 12 years proving that. But there was something unfinished between us. A sentence that had never been completed, a door that had been slammed but never properly closed. Tomorrow, in that boardroom, I would finally close it. I went to bed at midnight. When my alarm went off at 6, I felt something I hadn't expected, calm. Whatever happened next, I was ready. Monday, April 15th, 2024, 9:58 a.m. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Willis Tower had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. A mahogany conference table that could seat 14. Recessed lighting that made everyone look slightly more serious than they actually were. I sat at the head of the table, my high-backed leather chair turned away from the door. From where I was positioned, I could see the entire room reflected in the window glass, every face, every gesture, every flicker of expression. No one could see mine. The panel was already assembled. Margaret Sullivan sat to my left, her reading glasses perched on her nose, a legal pad in front of her. Derek Coleman was to my right, tablet open to the interview protocol. Victoria Palmer and Robert Mitchell, two of our board members, occupied the middle seats, their expressions professionally neutral. Amanda Torres, my executive assistant, sat in the corner with a laptop, ready to take notes. 6 people who knew exactly who I was. And one empty chair, waiting for the man who didn't. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. I watched his reflection cross the threshold. Gray suit, slightly too tight across the shoulders. Red tie, knotted too high. The same rigid posture I remembered from childhood, the same self-satisfied tilt of his chin. Raymond Hayes walked into my boardroom like he already owned it. "Mr. Hayes," Derek said, rising to shake his hand. "Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." My father nodded at the turned chair, at me, without a second glance. Just a cursory acknowledgement of the CEO he assumed was too important to face him directly. "Before we begin," Derek continued, "I need to inform you that this interview is being recorded per Article 14.3 of our interview protocol. Do you consent?" My father smiled. "Of course, I've got nothing to hide." The red light on the recording device blinked on. I kept my back to him and waited. Margaret opened the questioning. "Mr. Hayes, thank you for your interest in the COO position. Could you walk us through your management experience?" My father leaned back in his chair. I could see it in the window's reflection, and began what was clearly a rehearsed speech. 28 years at Morrison Auto Parts," he said. "Started on the floor, worked my way up to operations manager. At my peak, I oversaw a team of 200 employees across 3 facilities." He paused for effect. "Nobody questioned my authority. When I gave an order, people followed it." "Impressive," Robert Mitchell said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Why did you leave Morrison?" A slight hesitation. "Corporate restructuring. The new ownership brought in their own people. Happens all the time in this industry." He waved a hand dismissively. "They didn't know how to recognize talent when they had it." I knew the truth, of course. I'd done my research. Raymond Hayes had been terminated in 2019 following a formal complaint about his management style, specifically his refusal to adapt to new workplace policies and his pattern of dismissing input from younger employees and women. The company had offered him a severance package to leave quietly. He'd taken it. But that wasn't what he was telling this room. Victoria Palmer leaned forward. "Mr. Hayes, how would you describe your leadership philosophy?" "Discipline," he said immediately. "Clear hierarchy. People need to know who's in charge. That's the problem with workplaces today. Too much hand-holding, too much collaboration." He made air quotes around the word. "In my experience, you get results by setting expectations and holding people accountable. Period." Margaret made a note on her legal pad. I couldn't see what she wrote, but I could guess. "Tell us about your family," she said, her voice perfectly casual. "Do you have children?" My father's posture shifted slightly, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. "I have a son," he said. "Marcus. He's rebuilding his business right now. Got my drive, my work ethic. That's what matters, passing the legacy to the right person." In the window, I saw Margaret's eyes flick toward my turned chair. "And your daughter?" she asked. The room seemed to contract around that question. My father laughed, a short, dismissive sound that I recognized from 1,000 childhood memories. "I had a daughter," he said. "Had. Kicked her out about 12 years ago." No one spoke. In the reflection, I saw Derek's hand pause over his tablet. Amanda stopped typing. My father didn't notice. He was too busy performing. "She was useless," he continued, leaning back like he was telling a story at a bar. "Refused to do what was best for the family, wanted to be independent." He said the words with exaggerated air quotes, his voice dripping with contempt. "Go to college, have a career. You know the type." Margaret's pen had stopped moving. "And where is she now?" "Who knows?" My father shrugged. "Who cares? Probably working some dead-end job somewhere, if she's working at all. Women like that. He shook his head. They think they're special, but they never amount to anything. Too stubborn. Too proud. Victoria Palmer shifted in her seat. Robert Mitchell's jaw tightened. My father was oblivious. Best decision I ever made getting rid of her, he said. A man needs a son to carry on his name. Daughters? He waved his hand dismissively. They're just expenses. Liabilities. You feed them, clothe them, put a roof over their heads, and what do you get? Nothing. They leave, they forget you, they throw everything back in your face. He chuckled to himself, pleased with his own wisdom. If she walked in here right now, he added, I wouldn't even recognize her. And honestly, I wouldn't want to. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat perfectly still, my back to him, watching his reflection in the glass. Watching him smile. Watching him wait for someone to agree with him. No one did. Margaret looked at me. Derek looked at me. The whole room looked at the back of my chair, waiting. I placed my hands on the armrests, and slowly I began to turn. If you've ever been told you weren't good enough by someone who should have believed in you, I see you. Before I tell you what happened when that chair turned around, I want to ask, what would you have said in that moment? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss what comes next. But I didn't turn. Not yet. I stopped myself mid-motion, fingers tight on the armrests. The timing wasn't right. I needed more. I needed him to dig deeper into his own grave before I showed him who was holding the shovel. Margaret understood. She'd seen my hands move and stop. Without missing a beat, she redirected. Mr. Hayes, she said smoothly, you're applying for a position that reports directly to our CEO, Casey Hayes. What do you know about our founder? My father straightened, clearly relieved to move past the awkward silence his comments had created. Casey Hayes, he repeated, nodding. Read the Forbes article. Impressive story. Started from nothing, built this whole company from the ground up. He gestured vaguely at the room around us. That's the kind of leader I can respect. Someone who understands hard work, sacrifice, not like... He caught himself, then smiled. Well, not like some people I've known. Did you see the photograph in that article? Margaret asked. Her voice was perfectly level. The Forbes piece included a full-page portrait of our CEO. My father waved his hand. Skimmed it. I'm more interested in results than faces, to be honest. The numbers speak for themselves. He leaned forward confidentially. Between you and me, I don't put much stock in those puff pieces. What matters is what happens in the room. The real work. In the window, I watched Margaret's reflection glance at me. He had held a photograph of his own daughter in his hands. He had read her name, Kennedy Charlotte Hayes, printed beneath her face, and he hadn't recognized her, because he had never really seen her at all. Derek cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, I want to circle back to something we mentioned at the start. He tapped his tablet, pulling up a document. You confirmed your consent to the recording of this interview under Article 14.3 of Meridian's interview protocol. I just want to make sure you understand what that means. My father looked mildly annoyed at the interruption. Yes, I consented. I said that already. I understand. But for the record, Derek's voice remained professionally neutral. Everything said in this room is being documented and may be reviewed by our executive team, our board of directors, and our legal counsel if necessary. Fine by me. My father spread his hands. I stand by everything I've said, every word. Including your comments about your daughter? A flicker of something crossed my father's face. Irritation, maybe, or the first hint of unease. But he recovered quickly. That's personal, he said. Nothing to do with the job. Character assessment is part of our executive evaluation process, Derek replied evenly. How candidates discuss their personal relationships often indicates how they'll handle professional ones. My father's jaw tightened. Look, I don't know what kind of company this is, but where I come from, family business stays family business. I answered the question honestly. If that's a problem. It's not a problem, Derek said. It's documented. He made a note on his tablet and sat back. In the reflection, I saw my father's hands clench briefly on the armrests of his chair. He was starting to sense that something had shifted, that the room's energy had changed in a way he couldn't quite identify. But he still didn't look at the turned chair. He still didn't see me. While my father fumbled through his next answer, something about synergy and operational excellence that he'd clearly memorized from a management book, I let my mind drift back. June 2012. The night after he threw me out. I was sitting in my car in a Walmart parking lot, engine off to save gas, watching the dashboard clock tick past midnight. I had $200, half a tank of fuel, and nowhere to go. My phone buzzed. One new email. I almost didn't open it. I knew what it would say. I knew it would hurt. But some part of me, the part that still hoped, still believed that maybe he'd realize he'd made a mistake, couldn't stop my thumb from tapping the notification. Subject, final. Don't ever contact this family again. You are no longer my daughter. R. Hayes. I read it 7 times in the glow of the parking lot lights. Each time the words cut a little deeper. Each time I waited for tears that wouldn't come. On the 8th read, I did something that would matter 12 years later. I forwarded the email to a new address, one I just created, and saved it in a folder labeled Proof. Then 3 years later, when Margaret became my mentor and I finally told her the truth about my family, I forwarded it to her as well. Keep this, she'd said. You never know when you'll need proof of who someone really is. I'd kept it, and so had she. Now, sitting in my boardroom with my back to the man who'd written those words, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not grief, but clarity. He had put his cruelty in writing. He had signed his name to it, and today he would finally have to face what that meant. Victoria Palmer leaned forward, her expression carefully neutral. Mr. Hayes, you mentioned earlier that you value discipline and clear hierarchy. How do you think those values would translate to leading a diverse team here at Meridian? My father smiled, the confident, patronizing smile of a man who believed he was about to say something profound. Look, he said, I'll be honest with you. The problem with modern workplaces is that everyone wants to be special. Everyone wants a voice. He shook his head. But that's not how you get results. You need someone at the top who makes decisions, and everyone else needs to fall in line. And if team members have different perspectives, Victoria pressed, different approaches, then they need to learn to adapt. My father's tone hardened slightly. I've managed hundreds of people over the years. The ones who succeeded were the ones who listened. The ones who failed, he paused, and I knew what was coming, were the ones who thought they knew better, like my daughter. He couldn't help himself. He kept circling back. She had all these ideas about what she wanted to do with her life, he continued. College, career, independence. He said the word like it was a disease. I tried to guide her. I tried to show her the right path. But some people just can't be taught. Robert Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Hayes, women especially, my father added, as if this were a natural conclusion. They get these notions in their heads, and there's no reasoning with them. My daughter was the worst of them. Stubborn, ungrateful, completely blind to what I was trying to do for her. He leaned back, satisfied. If she walked in here right now, he said again, I wouldn't even recognize her. And frankly, based on who she was back then, I doubt she's done anything worth recognizing. In the window, I watched Margaret's reflection turn toward me. It was time. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. I could feel it even with my back turned, a tension that pressed against the walls, a silence that had grown teeth. Amanda Torres had stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Victoria Palmer and Robert Mitchell exchanged a look, The kind of wordless communication that happens when two people witness something they can't quite believe. Derek's finger rested on his tablet, but he wasn't taking notes anymore. He was watching, waiting. And Margaret sat perfectly still, her reading glasses reflecting the overhead lights, her expression unreadable to anyone who didn't know her as well as I did. But I knew her, and I could see the steel beneath the surface. My father, oblivious to all of it, cleared his throat. "So," he said, his voice carrying that same self-assured cadence, "when do I get to meet this Casey Hayes? I've got a lot to offer, and I'd like to make my case directly to the decision-maker." No one answered. The silence stretched. 3 seconds, 5, 7. My father shifted in his seat. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not quite concern, but the beginning of awareness. The sense that a room full of people who had been listening politely were now looking at him differently. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Margaret removed her reading glasses, folded them, set them on the table with a soft click. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm and measured, "I think it's time you met our CEO." My father straightened, adjusting his tie. "About time. I was starting to wonder if she's been here the whole time." He blinked. "What?" Margaret's eyes moved to my chair. "Kennedy," she said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." I placed my hands on the armrests, took a breath, and turned around. The chair rotated smoothly, silently, until I was facing the length of the conference table. Afternoon light from the floor-to-ceiling windows fell across my face. I watched my father's expression change in real time. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked almost like physical pain. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Ken." The word caught in his throat. "Kennedy?" "Hello, Dad." The color drained from his face. He stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a muted thud. "This is—" He looked around the room, searching for someone to tell him this was a mistake, a joke, a misunderstanding. No one moved. "This is some kind of joke." "No joke." I kept my voice level, my hands folded on the table in front of me. "Casey Hayes, Kennedy Charlotte Hayes, your useless daughter." I let the words hang in the air. "The one you kicked out 12 years ago." He stared at me like I was a ghost, which, in a way, I was. The ghost of everything he'd dismissed, everything he'd discarded. "You're the CEO," he said. It wasn't a question. Founder and CEO. I gestured at the room around us, the mahogany table, the skyline view, the 6 professionals who had just watched him condemn me without knowing I was listening. 47 million in revenue last year, 89 employees, offices in 3 cities. I reached across the table and picked up his resume, the one Derek had printed for the interview. "And right now," I said, "I'm holding your application." My father's hands were shaking. I could see them trembling at his sides, clenching and unclenching. "I didn't know," he said. "Kennedy, I didn't—" "No." I set the resume down in front of me. "You didn't, because you never bothered to find out." The room was absolutely silent. Every eye was on us. On him, pale and stammering. On me, steady and still. 12 years ago, he had looked at me and seen nothing worth keeping. Now he was looking at me again, and this time, he couldn't look away. My father's survival instincts kicked in. I watched it happen. The moment he shifted from shock to damage control, his expression rearranging itself into something softer, more pleading. "Kennedy, sweetheart." I held up my hand. Don't call me that." He flinched but pressed on. "You have to understand. I was trying to protect you. The world is hard for women, especially back then. I thought if you kicked me out with $200 and told me I was dead to you." I was angry. He stepped forward, palms out, the picture of wounded fatherhood. "Parents say things they don't mean when they're angry. You know that. You have to know that. You sent me an email." My voice didn't waver. "June 14th, 2012. Subject line, final, 3 sentences. Don't ever contact this family again. You are no longer my daughter. Signed with your name. I paused. That wasn't anger, Dad. That was a decision. His face went gray. I don't remember. I do. Margaret spoke for the first time since the reveal, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Kennedy forwarded that email to me in 2015. I've kept it in a secure folder ever since. She met my father's eyes without flinching. Would you like me to read it aloud, Mr. Hayes, for the record? My father's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The recording is still running, Derek added quietly. Everything said in this room is documented. I watched my father's shoulders sag, just slightly, but enough. The bluster was draining out of him, replaced by something smaller, something cornered. You don't get to rewrite history, I said, just because you're sitting in my boardroom. Derek tapped his tablet, and the room's speakers emitted a soft click, the sound of a recording being accessed. Mr. Hayes, he said, I want to play something back for you. My father's head snapped toward him. What? Per Article 14.3, all executive interviews are recorded with candidate consent. You gave that consent at the start of this meeting. Derek's finger hovered over the screen. Would you like to hear what you said about your daughter? About women in leadership? That's not relevant to... Useless, Derek read from his notes. A failure. Women like that never amount to anything. Daughters are just expenses, liabilities. He looked up. You said all of this, in a professional interview in front of 6 witnesses. My father's face had gone from gray to something closer to green. I was talking about someone else. You used her name, Victoria Palmer said, her voice cold. You described kicking her out 12 years ago. You said you wouldn't recognize her if she walked in. She gestured at me. There's no ambiguity here, Mr. Hayes. As a board member, Robert Mitchell added, I have to say, this is deeply concerning. Not just the content, but the judgment. You walked into a job interview and spent 15 minutes disparaging your own child. What does that tell us about how you'd treat employees? My father opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Derek set his tablet down. The recording doesn't lie, Mr. Hayes, and neither does your daughter. I watched my father's eyes dart around the room, searching for an ally, an exit, a way to spin this in his favor. He found nothing. I reached into the folder beside me and withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of the Forbes Chicago article from 2022, the one that had named me to their top 30 under 40 list, the one with my photograph on the cover, the one that spelled out my full name in bold letters beneath my face, Kennedy Charlotte Hayes, founder and CEO, Meridian Consulting Group. I slid it across the table toward my father. You said you read this article, I said. You told Margaret you admired Casey Hayes, that you respected someone who started from nothing and built something real. He stared at the page like it might bite him. Look at the picture, Dad. His eyes moved to the photograph, my photograph. The same face he'd watched grow up, the same face he'd dismissed as worthless, the same face he'd told this room he wouldn't recognize. You had this in your hands, I said. My face, my name, my story, everything I built after you threw me away. I leaned forward slightly. And you still didn't see me. I didn't... His voice cracked. I didn't look at the picture. No, I said. You didn't. I sat back in my chair. You never did. The article lay between us on the polished mahogany, a bridge he could have crossed at any point in the last 2 years, if he'd only bothered to look, if he'd cared enough to see who Casey Hayes really was. But he hadn't, because to Raymond Hayes his daughter had never been worth looking at. My father's strategy shifted again. I watched it happen, the moment he realized that denial wasn't working, that justification wasn't working, and that his only remaining option was the one he'd always used as a last resort: guilt. Kennedy, please. His voice dropped, softened. I need this job. You don't understand what's happened. Then explain it to me. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. The bank is taking the house. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. Marcus's business failed, completely. He lost everything. He paused, and I saw him calculating his next words. And your mother is sick. I went still. Mom is sick? Diabetes. Type 2. She needs treatment, medication, monitoring. We can't afford it. He leaned forward, sensing an opening. Kennedy, I know I wasn't. I know things weren't perfect. But this is your family, your mother. She needs help. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I looked at my father, really looked at him. The gray suit that didn't quite fit anymore, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 12 years ago, the desperation beneath the performance. And you thought, I said slowly, that the best way to get help was to walk into my company and call me a failure? I didn't know it was your company. That's the point. I kept my voice even, though something cold had settled in my chest. You didn't know because you never cared to know. You didn't look at the Forbes article. You didn't Google Casey Hayes. You didn't do 5 minutes of research before walking into this interview. I shook my head. You don't get to use Mom as a bargaining chip, not after what you did. This is the moment everything changes. Raymond thought he could walk into my boardroom and get a second chance, but second chances aren't free. They're earned. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone who underestimated you, type boundaries in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed. The ending of this story is something you won't forget. I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind of motion that draws every eye in a room without demanding it. I picked up my father's resume from the table, held it in both hands, and looked at him. Mr. Hayes, I said, and the formality of it, the distance it created, made him flinch. Based on your interview performance today, I cannot offer you the COO position at Meridian Consulting Group. Kennedy, your comments about women in leadership demonstrate a fundamental misalignment with our company values. Your attitude toward family members, toward your own daughter, raises serious concerns about your capacity for empathy and collaboration. I set the resume down on the table, not in the shredder, not torn in half, just set aside. And your lack of self-awareness throughout this interview disqualifies you from a role that requires emotional intelligence and team leadership. My father's face had gone slack. You can't do this. I can. I straightened my jacket. I'm the CEO. This is my company. And this is my decision. This is revenge, he spat. This is you punishing me for... No. I cut him off, my voice steady. This isn't revenge. Revenge would be making copies of this recording and sending them to everyone you've ever worked with. Revenge would be calling Morrison Auto Parts and telling them what you said about women in their old operations manager's interview. I met his eyes. This is a professional decision. You're not qualified for this position. You demonstrated that yourself, in your own words, on the record. Derek rose from his seat. The interview is concluded, Mr. Hayes. I'll escort you out. My father stood frozen, his mouth working silently. I sat back down and turned my chair toward the window. I didn't watch him leave. I heard it all in the reflection of the glass. Derek's footsteps crossing to the door, the soft click of the handle, my father's voice, smaller now, stripped of its earlier bravado. This isn't over, Kennedy. I didn't turn around. You're going to regret this, he continued. When you realize what you've done to your family, to your mother. Mr. Hayes, Derek's voice was firm. This way, please. I watched the reflection as my father looked around the room one last time, searching for someone, anyone who might take his side. Victoria Palmer had turned away, studying her notes. Robert Mitchell was shaking his head slowly. Margaret sat motionless, her expression carved from stone. Amanda Torres, my assistant, was the only one who met his gaze. She looked at him the way you might look at something unpleasant you'd found on your shoe. You're all going to believe her? My father demanded. She's just a... Careful, Mr. Hayes. My voice carried across the room without me raising it. The recording is still running. He went silent. Derek placed a hand on his arm, not roughly, but with unmistakable finality. Sir, now. I watched my father's shoulders slump, watched him take one last look at the back of my chair, watched him turn and walk through the door that Derek held open. The click of it closing was one of the most satisfying sounds I'd ever heard. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Amanda's voice, barely above a whisper. That was your father? I turned my chair back to face the room. 6 people stared at me with varying degrees of shock, sympathy, and respect. I said quietly. He was my father, 12 years ago. I took a breath. Now he's just a candidate who didn't get the job. The silence that followed my father's departure lasted exactly 7 seconds. I know because I counted them, a habit I'd developed in high-stakes negotiations, a way of measuring the weight of a moment. Then Margaret moved. She crossed the room and stood beside my chair, one hand resting briefly on my shoulder. It was the most physical affection she'd ever shown me in a professional setting. Are you okay? She asked quietly. I will be. Victoria Palmer set down her pen. Kennedy, I had no idea. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I appreciate that, Victoria. But I made my choice. I knew what might happen when I let the interview proceed. Robert Mitchell leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For what it's worth, you handled that with more grace than most people would have. I've seen executives crumble under less pressure. The recording is secured, Derek said, returning from escorting my father to the elevator. Backed up to our legal server per protocol. If he tries to claim discrimination or wrongful rejection, we have full documentation of his statements. Thank you, Derek. Amanda was still staring at me with wide eyes. He really didn't know? All this time he didn't know you were the CEO? He never looked. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. He read an article about Casey Hayes with my photograph right there on the page, and he never looked closely enough to see his own daughter. Margaret squeezed my shoulder once, then released it. What do you want to do about your mother? I was quiet for a moment, considering. That's a separate conversation, I said finally. One I'll have on my own terms, not his. She nodded. Good. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, the whispers had started. I didn't try to stop them. In a company of 89 people, secrets don't stay secret for long, especially not secrets that involve the CEO and a dramatic boardroom confrontation. Someone always talks. Someone always knows someone who was walking past the conference room at the wrong moment. By the end of the day, the unofficial version of events had spread through every department. The CEO had rejected her own father for the COO position. He'd said something terrible about her. The interview had been recorded. I let the rumors circulate. Then, at 5:47 p.m., I sent a company-wide email. Team, today's COO interview concluded without a successful candidate. We will continue our search through appropriate channels. I want to thank everyone involved in the process for their professionalism and discretion. If you have questions, my door is open, but I trust you to respect that some matters are personal, and I appreciate your understanding. Casey Hayes. It was deliberately vague. It confirmed nothing and denied nothing. But it accomplished what I needed. It signaled that I was aware of what people were saying, that I wasn't hiding, and that I expected the same professionalism from my team that I demanded from myself. By the next morning, the whispers had shifted. People weren't talking about what had happened in the boardroom anymore. They were talking about how I'd handled it. And that, I realized, mattered more than any explanation I could have given. 2 weeks later, Derek forwarded me an email. It was a reference request from a company called Lakefront Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial firm on the South Side. They were considering Raymond Douglas Hayes for an operations manager position and wanted to verify his interview history with Meridian. How do you want me to handle this? Derek asked. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Tell them the truth. The whole truth? The professional truth. I turned back to my laptop. He was interviewed for a senior position and was not selected. His comments during the interview raised concerns about his suitability for leadership roles. That's factual. That's documented. That's all they need to know. Derek nodded and left. I found out later, through channels I won't disclose, that Lakefront Manufacturing declined to move forward with my father's application. So did two other companies he applied to in the following months. Word travels in certain industries. Reference checks matter. And when a candidate's most recent interview includes recorded statements about women being expenses and liabilities, hiring managers tend to notice. By July, the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on my parents' house. The property went to auction in September. I didn't intervene. Some people might call that cold. Some people might say I should have helped. That family is family, regardless of what happened. But I had spent 12 years building something from nothing. I had earned every dollar, every client, every square foot of my office. Raymond Hayes had earned this too. 1 week after the interview, I made a phone call I'd been avoiding for 12 years. My mother answered on the fourth ring. Hello? Her voice was older than I remembered, thinner, more fragile, but it was still her. Mom, it's Kennedy. Silence. Then a sound that might have been a sob, quickly suppressed. Kennedy? Is that really you? It's really me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 12 years of silence hung between us like a curtain, heavy and impenetrable. I heard you're sick, I said finally. Diabetes. Your father told you. It wasn't a question. He tried to use it to get a job from me. That's not why I'm calling. Another pause. Then why? I looked out my office window at the Chicago skyline, the same view I'd stared at the night before the interview, the night I'd decided to face my past instead of running from it. Because you're my mother, I said, and I want to know how you are, not through him, from you. We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about her diagnosis, her medications, the specialist she couldn't afford to see regularly. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I made her an offer. I'll pay for your treatment. All of it. But there's a condition. What condition? I won't speak to Dad. Ever. This is between you and me. If he tries to use you to get to me, if he tries to make this about him, it's over. Do you understand? A long silence. Then, I understand. Friday, April 26th, 2024. 11 days after the interview that changed everything, I sat in the same boardroom, same mahogany table, same floor-to-ceiling windows, same view of the Chicago skyline, and signed the biggest contract in Meridian's history. Thomas Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Industries, slid the final page across the table. $8.2 million, a 3-year consulting engagement, the kind of deal that would push our annual revenue past $50 million. Ms. Hayes, he said, extending his hand, I've heard great things about your leadership, looking forward to working together. I shook his hand firmly. Likewise, Mr. Hartwell, Meridian delivers results. After the signing, after the handshakes and the photographs and the champagne toast, Margaret found me standing alone by the window. You did it, she said quietly, despite everything. I watched the afternoon light play across the buildings below. Because of everything, I learned a long time ago that I'm the only one responsible for my success. No one was going to hand it to me. No one was going to make it easier. Your father, my father is irrelevant. I turned to face her. He was irrelevant the day he sent that email. I just didn't know it yet. Margaret smiled, a rare expression for her, but genuine. The board is impressed, she said. Not just with the contract, with how you handled the situation. Good. I picked up my copy of the signed agreement. Now let's get back to work. The email arrived in early May, exactly 3 weeks after the interview. Subject, reaching out. Kennedy, I heard what happened with Dad. I know we haven't talked in a long time, but I was hoping we could reconnect. Things have been tough lately, and I was wondering if you might have a position for me at your company. I've learned a lot from my business experience, and I think I could be a real asset to your team. Let me know. Marcus. I read it twice, then leaned back in my chair. My brother, the golden child, the one who'd received $45,000 for college while I'd scraped together scholarships and worked 3 jobs, the one whose failed business had burned through our parents' savings, the one who hadn't reached out once in 12 years. Not when I started my company, not when I made the Forbes list, not when I became someone worth knowing. Now he wanted a job. I typed my response in under a minute. Marcus, I appreciate you reaching out. However, Meridian's hiring process is competitive and based on qualifications. If you're interested in a position, you're welcome to apply through our website like any other candidate. Best, KC Hayes, CEO, Meridian Consulting Group. I hit send without hesitation. He never replied, he never applied, and I never heard from him again. Some bridges, once burned, stay burned. June 2024. A Saturday afternoon. I flew into O'Hare and took a cab to a coffee shop in Oak Park. Neutral territory, far from Cicero, far from the house where I'd grown up and been thrown away. My mother was already there when I arrived. She sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, looking smaller than I remembered. Her hair had gone almost entirely gray. The lines around her eyes were deeper, carved by years I hadn't witnessed. She stood when she saw me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she crossed the distance between us and pulled me into a hug. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." I let her hold me, let myself feel the weight of those words, the acknowledgement I'd waited 12 years to hear. "I know, Mom." We sat down, ordered coffee, talked about small things at first, the weather, her medications, how the treatment was going. I paid for everything, as I'd promised. She didn't mention my father, and I didn't ask. When it was time to leave, she hugged me again at the door. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I should have said it years ago, but I'm saying it now." I held her a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you. That means something." It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a start. I saw him as we walked out of the coffee shop. A blue sedan parked across the street. The driver's side window was down, and behind it sat my father, older, grayer, watching us with an expression I couldn't read from this distance. Our eyes met. For 3 seconds, neither of us moved. The afternoon sun hung between us, casting long shadows across the pavement. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. I didn't acknowledge him in any way. I simply turned, helped my mother into the cab I'd called, and closed the door behind her. When I looked back, the blue sedan was still there. My father hadn't moved. He sat behind the wheel, watching his daughter and his wife drive away together. Without him. I got into my own cab and gave the driver the address for O'Hare. As we pulled away, I saw the sedan shrink in the rearview mirror, smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely. That was the last time I ever saw Raymond Hayes. I don't know what he was hoping for. Forgiveness, maybe. Or just the chance to be seen, to be acknowledged as my father one more time. But some doors, once closed, stay closed. That was the boundary I set. And I kept it. I'm standing in my office now watching the sunset over Chicago. The city stretches out below me. Millions of lives, millions of stories, millions of people fighting their own battles against the voices that told them they weren't enough. 12 years ago, my father looked at me and saw nothing worth keeping. He called me useless. He called me a failure. He wrote those words in an email and signed his name to them. Today, I run a company worth more than everything he ever owned. I have a team of 89 people who trust me. I have clients who respect me. I have a life I built with my own hands, from nothing, with no one's help. But that's not the victory. The victory is knowing that my worth was never his to decide, it was always mine. If you're watching this and you've been told you're not enough, by a parent, a partner, a boss, anyone, I want you to know something. They're wrong. Your value isn't determined by people who can't see it. Build your own table, set your own boundaries, and never let anyone make you feel small again. Thank you for watching my story. If it resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. Drop a comment telling me, what boundary have you set that changed your life? I read every single one. And if you want more stories about standing your ground and finding your worth, check out the video in the description. I think you'll love it. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and remember, you are enough.